Genasi are elemental creatures born of planar magics in the elemental planes and often the offspring of genies. But if you've watched the other videos in this series, you would know genie or Genasi could be made through a human being, subject to energies of the elemental planes and transformed by them. So we are here to answer the question again, why couldn't that happen in all of the other planes? We have covered the inner planes and celestial planes, so this time, the lower planes. Realms and dimensions of evil, both of order and of chaos. You die a bad person and you go to one of these planar hells. But we can't have our genie or Genasi simply be plane-touched races. In the hells, that would just be a tiefling. So how can we create a fantasy space for the genie to tie into the role of elementals, wishes, and lamps when it comes to being evil? If genies are created by exposure to planar magics, then what would happen if a similar process happened in the river Styx of Hades or the endless screams of Pandemonium? Well, I'm glad you asked. But first, if you need a refresher on previous videos, here's a recap. I made a Genasi race for every plane of existence. Genies are created through the soul's exposure to the magics of a given plane. I surmised this was similar to how fossilization replaces bones with minerals. The soul is replaced with the magic of said plane. But just as the minerals hold the shape of the bone, the genie still holds the imprint of the soul and its desires. For a time, that leads them to kingdoms, money, and material things to try to feel fulfilled. But they become noble genies when they realize that they can only satisfy their needs of ambition through proxy, by fulfilling the wishes of men, those who still have souls. So a conglomerate of wishes started to form where all the noble genies teamed up and with their powers combined started fulfilling the wishes of men, even to create the gods that govern them, using vessels or lamps to safely cross outside of the plane that they were born in. Some of these wishes include offspring some humans couldn't have otherwise, birthing the Genasi race, who then in turn have their own souls, so can choose to help the conglomerate or simply go off to their own ambitions. Genies of the material planes set the rules, genies of the inner planes break the rules, and genies of the elemental planes provide the wishing building blocks. Check out the video on the inner planes for a more in-depth exploration of the lore and the planes of the shadow, fae, and ethereal, then check out the video on the upper planes to learn how wish makers work in the realms of the good. But enough stalling. Let's see how genie lore makes sense for the lower planes. Limbo is a plane of utter and complete chaos, a giant bowl of atomized soup, where a large rock becomes a large potato, then melts into a puddle of mercury, then explodes like propane. The only way something stays stable is if something enforces their will upon it. And if you know anything about quantum mechanics, where something does not exist unless it is observed, then you would actually be getting pretty close. As long as you have the mind power strong enough, you can live comfortably in your own castle, floating around in, well, everything else, observing it enough to make it real. But now begs the question, what happens to a soul when it fossilizes in the plane of Limbo? This one was another hard one to answer. It can't become a genie of chaos, because to me, genies are not embodiments of concepts like law or good. That's what modrons or angels are for, respectively. Instead, they are embodiments of physical matter, like water, earth, fire, air, etc. However, they are influenced by those concepts, as the magic of different planes fossilizes different desires of the soul, like a metal Genasi from Mechanus reflecting the soul's desire for order in the last video. It was in this process that I realized that in a fantasy world, magic was itself a physical matter, something you can experience with your senses. But in the case of Limbo, it's magic without form. It is quantum particles waiting for instruction. At some point, magic is just science we don't understand. And because it is the chaotic Limbo, fossilized souls here becomes wild magic genies, which eventually give rise to wild magic Genasi. They reflect the ambitions of the soul for complete chaos, the ADHD to the plane of Mechanus's OCD. Or it's the soul's desire for no ambition at all. For ambition is too orderly of a concept. This puts them in a unique position to not get fulfillment from fulfilling wishes, but by seeing those wishes go off the rails. So in a way, they are the antagonists of the genie conglomerate. They take on the role of ensuring wishes are fulfilled in the most chaotic way possible. And being the literal genie of magic, they must be involved in any wish-making process, only counteracted by the metal genies of Mechanus who try to balance that scale. Order versus chaos instead of good versus evil. This is why genie wishes are often so chaotic. It may not be the fault of the genie you made the wish to. When you make wishes offhandedly, like when you go up to your attic and say something like, "Aw man, I wish it was brighter up here." Well, if a wild magic genie hears you, you may just burst into a ball of flame, lighting up the area around you. Pandemonium is a world of never-ending tunnels and winds so intense, it rips away sound itself, leaving you deaf and spiraling towards insanity. Natural light cannot be sustained, and not even deities willingly make their domain here. The only call to adventurers are the rumored hoards of treasure, hidden in this realm where they thought no mortal would dare to go, with the most guaranteed risk of losing grip of reality. But just as it rips away sound, it rips away joy, hope, belonging, leaving you just as the tunnels around you an empty shell. And so, genies and genasi of the plane of Pandemonium are born of the soul's desire when it's full of depression, despair, loss, resignation, and nihilism. Unlike the shadow genie's ambition for undeath and continuing life no matter the consequences, these genies reflect the soul's wish for the end of themselves, as well as the end of everything else. But don't be confused, they do not wish for destruction and ruin, but for entropy and for nothingness. But when it comes to the elemental form that this genie takes, I first thought of sound, with the howling winds. But the fact that the winds literally rip sound away, it had to be something else. This plane is degradation, obliteration. The sound and winds rip rock into dust, removes any moisture, and leaves the plane desolate. So a dust or sand genie or genasi might just fit the bill, leaving the sound genie where I left it in the upper plane of Arcadia. As the birthplace of demons, the Abyss is the chaotic evil plane with infinite layers, though the nature of the plane is consistent: violence and malevolence. The wishes of murderers, serial killers, and cannibals are reflected in the genies and genasi that were made here. With it being considered as the wound of reality and a place of eternal torture, I think a genie of blood would be a good fit. While the upper planes reflect an evolution of the elements and building blocks of reality, the lower planes reflect a degradation or a deterioration of those same elements. So, like the Beast Genasi reflects the evolution of the primordial soup, the Blood Genasi is life without a vessel, the thing that spills at the end of life itself. With other locations like the Blood Rift, the Sea of Blood, and the Blood War, there is an obvious pattern here. And I think it's important to reiterate that genies, even from the upper or lower planes, are still more of a neutral alignment, at least in the context of the lore that we are creating. Before the blood genie becomes noble, their fossilized ambitions are for blood and savagery, but not out of evil intent, but just for the need of fulfillment. So then, when they realize it needs to be through proxy and become noble genies, they fulfill man's wishes for blood and savagery. It is just by happenstance that those wishes generally come from those less than upstanding citizens. A plane that is basically a 6-layered supermax prison, Carceri, also known as Tartarus, is home to thieves and backstabbers of all kinds. Configured like a Russian nesting doll, it is said to be impossible to break out. These are where the dissenters go, quite literally the poison of society, which is why I originally gravitated towards a poison genasi for this plane. But with more investigation, I discovered many of the layers of Carceri having more of an acidic theme: acid rain, acid snow, and even acid trees. And to me, acid seems to be more of a chaotic element, where many poisons are bases, which seem more lawful to me, and so would be of a more lawful plane. That makes sense, right? And acid still represents the more obvious degradation of society, where poisons might be a little less obvious. If you think this is too close to the Ooze Genasi from the Inner Planes video, I went back and edited the racial features to include making your own ooze familiar instead of purely acid attacks, making them thematically different to this one. But as for the plane of Carceri, you have an acid genie or genasi, a combination of the fire and water elements, fulfilling the soul's ambition and wishes of criminals, rebels, and prisoners. Also known as the Grey Wastes, Hades is a land of pure evil where chaos and law are in an equal balance. And being quite literally a gray area, uncaring, detached, and dismal, this plane sucks emotion, life, and hope. Unlike Pandemonium, where the desire is for the world to fade into nothingness, Hades is where its denizens want to take physical action to rid the world of everything that is good. And with one of the main features of Hades being the river Styx, I think it is appropriate for a degradation of the water element, making a salt genie or genasi. The salt being the mineral deposits of the river Styx, as it also deposits souls. Not only is salt neither an acid or a base, which makes sense in its grayness, but good souls are biblically considered the salt of the earth. Take a soul and remove the goodness, and you have regular salt. Many villains, cult members, or terrorists often strive to make wishes to salt genies. The bleak eternity of Gehenna is a plane without charity, mercy, or pity. Always at a 45-degree angle, one could trip and fall for eternity, unless you traveled solely in the eviscerating furnaces of Krangath's caves. Rivers of lava, smoke vents, and mud pots completely cover the landscape. If we refer to this image by Apothecary Press, we see that the lower plane's degradation does this to the elements, altering them negatively, and that the plane of Gehenna might be a really good fit for the ash element. However, we have already done a smoke element, which in my opinion is way too similar, especially as far as abilities go in a Genasi Ray stat block. So let's instead take the mud pots and make a genie or genasi of tar. In some ways, the degradation akin to the plant genasi of Arborea. If you don't know, tar is made from organic matter like plants that break down underground and eventually become incredibly sticky goop. So, tar genies are born from the soul's desire for power and authority. They wish to subjugate and control, or to trap people within their tar of influence in a way that there is no escape. Tyrants, dictators, cult leaders, and slavers all have a reason to seek out a tar genie. I can also just imagine the army of undead mammoths that they may just have behind them. Finally, the one that many of you have been waiting for, the 9 Hells of Baator, home to the hierarchy of devils. A lawful evil plane of plotting, scheming, and making magical contracts within the bounds of rules and regulations. Home of your politicians, lawyers, law enforcement, and any other figure that manipulates the law for their own gain. Easy to figure out the ambitions of the soul that would manifest through a fossilized genie here, but only if the soul wasn't taken and sold within the soul economy of the devils first. The question that the element could represent was actually a little more difficult than it may appear, as it is with planes with multiple layers because each layer can look wildly different. A fire-adjacent element would be too easy, and would be too close to what we already have with the tiefling, as well as not representative of all the other layers, like swamps and ice, that have little to do with fire. But that is when it became more obvious. Looking at the hidden intentions and the methodical manipulation of the plane, we find corruption much less obvious than the evil of the prisons of Carceri, the real poison of society that lie in our very own government. And if you think about it, poisons come in many different forms. When you are poisoned, does it cause your nerves to feel like fire, like in Avernus? Or does it cause you to be numb and cold, like the layer of Stygia? Or does it cause pus-filled boils to manifest from the swamps of Minoros? Poisons can vary a lot, similar to the faces of politicians. So of any of the lower planes, I think the 9 Hells gets the poison genie or genasi, a slow and sometimes unnoticeable toxic cancer. And just like my own headcanon of Radiant Genasi being the middleman for angels, these genies might just be the ones to hook you up with the right devil in order to grant you a poisonous wish. Being the most lawful of the evil planes, Acheron is a plane of planetoids of geometrical shapes. These shapes are home to a variety of factions that wait for their planetoid to drift and collide with another just to continue an eternal war with those that are on the other side. And where I first pictured the concept of war as being more chaotic, like battles in the plane of Yisgard, I guess I see the difference as war for the sake of personal honor versus war for the sake of law and ideals. Where Yisgard seeks honor in proving yourself, Acheron seeks for everyone to be under one law, and they all think that their law is best. So here you see warmongers, genociders, extremist paladins, colonizers, and even rebels. Some believe that they are doing what is best for society, but do not care how many lives are taken in the process. Where the plane of Arcadia is harmony, that we touched on in the last video, Acheron is conformity. The other closest plane to Acheron is Mechanus with metal genies, and what do you have when you bring a metal sword to an endless war? You get a rust genie or Genasi, one that is born from a soul that would fight, not for what they think is right, but for what they think is necessary until the bitter end, at whatever cost. And with all the lower planes, there is yet one more plane that ties all of the lower planes together, the negative plane. And if you saw the last video where we covered the positive plane, the plane of life giving light and matter, the negative plane is the opposite of that. Where the positive plane bursts the universe, the negative plane is the death of it. Matter versus antimatter. To me, everything that has and will exist will eventually be consumed by the void of the negative plane and cease to exist. Souls here that survive long enough are fossilized to reflect the desire and ambition for destruction and ruin. But while the plane of Pandemonium is very much a passive desire for entropy, the negative plane hungers for it, and will stop at nothing until existence itself is consumed. It is destruction without reason. The desire to topple a government just to see if they could. A pleasure in corrupting a good soul, seeing a forest and burning it down just because of an impulsive thought. Psychopaths, sociopaths, and maniacs. Congratulations, you are the Dark Urge character in Baldur's Gate 3. As for the elemental that is born in the negative plane, a great template for a genie is actually the Zeg-Yi and Zeg-Ya, or the yin and yang, if you will. Elementals that are so completely opposite that if they ever touch, would create an energy explosion similar to that of an atom bomb. Unless maybe, of course, you had a Deadpool and Wolverine there to stop it. There's your forbidden love story that you didn't think you needed. But just as the Zeg-Ya could fossilize into a genie of matter, the Zeg-Yi could become the antimatter genie or Genasi, also called a void genie. But if void genies come from the negative plane and radiance genies comes from Mount Celestia, then what is left for genies of the astral plane? Well, our next video in the series will cover just that, as well as other outlier planes like the Plane of Dreams and the Far Realm. So subscribe to be notified and let me know in the comments below if you would change any of these planar genies or what kind of Genasi you would want to play most. Because for those of you who stayed to the end of the video, you can get a Genasi racial option for every plane of existence that we talked about today, linked below in the description. And if you want beautiful PDF versions, join my Patreon and get access to my entire homebrew library and other perks. If you're interested in other possibilities of how magic works in your world, check out my video on Aetherpunk genre of fantasy. Until then, go out there and make your worlds a better place. See ya.